it came about, we do a lot of development work for EasyJet and various other people. They've got huge marketing capabilities and stuff they do internally. And so we were challenged with kind of trying to show them really what Sitecore can do. What is the marketing automation piece there? What does XDB give them? All that sort of thing. So the stuff we're going to have a look at isn't actually in production, but it's more showing off the concepts, how you can actually go about working with it, how you can go about building it, what it looks like to be a developer doing stuff with this, what it looks like to be a marketer that actually uses it. So if you've not had a chance to see any of the marketing automation piece yet, by the end of it you will. You'll know how it works. And hopefully you'll have got an idea of how you can actually develop with it. So anyone in here that's a developer, just to get a feel of the sort of audience. So most of you guys and girls are developers. So there is a bit of marketing aspect to this in that I'll show you how you can actually use it from the front end, from a kind of marketeer's perspective. But then the rest of it is actually showing you how you work with it as a developer, so how you actually write the code that does all this stuff. So as Steve said, yeah, I'm Nick Hills. I work for Valtech. They've got a really kind of crazy jungle thing going on out there. I'm not sure if anyone's seen it yet, but it's quite a nice chilled out space. So if the throes of the sort of main bit of the conference is a bit much, then have a look, see what they've got in there. So what will we look at today? It's going to be kind of three or four key things. The first of which is, how does Sitecore take on marketing automation? What is it for Sitecore? What does it mean? As a marketer, what does that mean? And as a developer, what does that mean? Then, as you start to take this forwards, what's it like to actually build functionality for this? What's it like to kind of take it on as a tool, to debug it, to develop with it? And then finally, what's it like to deploy it? Because it's all well and good having this code running on your dev machine, but you've got to ship it. You've got to get it up to the cloud or to your infrastructure. So what is marketing automation? Coming into the development work we'd done and the sort of demos we were putting together, it wasn't necessarily something that I knew a huge amount about. So as I started to find out more, I then started to see that I was probably the recipient of things like marketing automation. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was looking at buying a new snowboard helmet. So I was going away on a trip. I started looking around a site, found a few I was interested in, put them in my basket, or maybe just browse them. So these are things that are quite familiar concepts within Sitecore, right? You can start to monitor what someone does through XDB, XConnect. So you've got that knowledge if you want to. You can store the sorts of things that people have been looking at. Then maybe a couple hours later, this email pops up. Oh, remember that you looked at this helmet. And here's a bit of even something more to incentivize it, some discounts. Add to that even some more personalization around, I think the imagery is kind of based on the sort of thing I was looking at. So behind the scenes, something happened there. Something was taking this data, was running as an engine. Now, how these guys did it, I don't know. I'm guessing it maybe isn't Sitecore, but who knows? And then all of a sudden, nothing had to be pressed manually. This email just came through. This is really cool from terms of tech. However, I feel slightly morally conflicted about this because it's kind of creating a lot of potential information flowing through the internet that maybe isn't the best use of the internet. But morals aside, I'll let you decide on whether you ethically believe this is a good thing, whether you advocate automation in this way. But yeah, that's my personal view. But the tech is cool, so let's concentrate on that bit. So how does Sitecore go about doing this? When in the Sitecore interface, how do you use these tools? Now, if we rewind probably 2 or 3 years, you'd see, I think it was engagement plans, and you'd see a Silverlight interface, which at the time kind of served the purpose, but it was all coupled very much into the CMS environment. And so the kind of scalability and just the splittability, I guess, that the stuff we saw earlier and the sort of approach that they're trying to advocate with that service approach to things didn't really exist. So now this has been rebuilt slightly, and what I'm hoping to do is I'll give you a quick demo of what this looks like. Okay, so this is just pretty much a stock Sitecore instance that I've got running up in the cloud. It's not admin B, so if people want to try getting into it, help yourself, but it is running live, but don't try it, you won't get anywhere. So you've got marketing automation, and within there you set up what are referred to as campaigns. Campaigns are kind of the flows. These are the sets of operations that run, and you can drop into it different activities, different actions, different decision points, and what we'll see is how we can actually build those ourselves. So first up, let's just have a look at an example of one. And let's get rid of, let's scroll down a wee bit and make it a bit smaller. So here we can see a flow of operations that's happening. Someone, typically as a contact or a user, will start at the top of these flows. Depending on rules that they might invoke, so has someone added something to the basket, has someone abandoned the basket, whatever it may be, you then hit these things that are referred to as actions. Actions being these entities that we can just drag and drop into the flow that we've got. And then within these actions and activities, you can actually add in parameters. So we could add in extra debug information if we wanted. Now, just debugging isn't probably the best use of this. Things get a lot more interesting if you want to do stuff like sending emails or sending text messages or customizing this in ways that allow you to do some neat things, some richer behaviors. Out the box, you get support for EXM. However, for the test that I was putting together, I wanted something simple and I wanted something that worked without really having to have all of EXM running. So plugged it into SendGrid and plugged it into Twilio. And the amount of code we were talking about was 40 lines of code, 50 lines of code. And from that, I could start to put this demo together where if someone chose to book a flight, it would send them a text message reminder if they didn't finish it. It would give them a little prod at the end just to say, oh, thanks for booking. Here's the details. Are you interested in hotels? It would do the upsell, the cross-sell, based on whatever I chose to put in those emails. Now, arguably, the ethics around that come into play a little bit, but that's down to how the marketers want to use it. Cool, can we go back to the slides now? Thanks. So what does it look like for marketers? We've seen kind of roughly what the UI contains, the way that people can use this. And we'll just go through the sort of key attributes of that, the key aspects that run there. So we've got actions. Actions are behaviors that are going to happen and things that will run when a user moves into those states. They're all well and good, but you actually need to probably introduce some decision points and decision logic there to say, if something has happened, go off and run a certain set of actions, and alternatively, if they haven't, go off and run counterpart ones. There's a bit of a difference in this slide and the next one in that these listeners are based around time as well. So you can say, for example, I want this yes or no fork to be valid for a day or for an hour or for 2 hours, whatever it might be. The slight difference in decision points is that that's based around just a pure yes or no concept. Behind the scenes, these have got rules associated with them. So I'm sure any of the developers here have probably done stuff with Sitecore rules. And what we'll do is we'll have a look at the subtle difference around the rule engine that's happening here, because we're not running it in the context of Sitecore kernel and the CMS. We're running it as a Windows service or a little executable. And then there's a few other things that you can do. There's kind of the rest of the stuff that we're available to you. So you might want to add a delay in. You might want to say, well, when someone enters this plan, let's wait a day, and then we'll send them that email to say, oh, do you want to go off and buy that snowboard helmet that you were looking at? It might be you want to move them to a different campaign, to restart the campaign, to just get them out of the campaign, you name it. So there's all sorts of options here that as a marketeer, you can kind of design the flows around, and as a developer, we can support by creating new ones. So then what does this look like for developers? What is it like to build and work with this and debug it and get to the bottom of what's going on? Because you've kind of got this engine that's doing stuff behind the scenes based on data and based on users. So how do we actually make sure this is doing what it's supposed to? Now, when you save the campaigns that we saw, they get pushed into the master database. They get pushed into a bucket. And so for just digging in and grabbing this screenshot, I just unbucketed it. That's as simple as it was. And what you've got is the plan data. This is the JSON that represents what we saw in that flowchart. Now, chances are you probably won't need to do a huge amount to actually work with that or change it, but for debugging and just for validating everything is where it should be, it can be quite a good tool to have. So the folder it lives in is Sitecore System Marketing Control Panel Automation Plans, and then you just dig into there and see what's going on. If you wanted to do a bulk upload across several plans, then that might be a way you could do it. The data also then, when you choose to deploy the plan, gets sent over into the actual engine itself. So there's a kind of duplicate copy there, so it doesn't need to always get to the master database. You've then got the actual engine itself. So what runs when this is out in the wild? So on your deployment into your infrastructure, what happens? Well, how is the marketing automation engine a thing? Well, first up, it's a Windows service. And the reason that this is stopped in this screenshot is because I was debugging it and I didn't really want to attach to the Windows service. And I'll show you some good ways that we can do that later on. Alternatively, if you want to on your dev machine, you just click the exe, the maengine.exe, and as long as everything is deployed there, you can run it on demand. So you're not waiting on a Windows service that feels a little bit remote from your sort of developer experience. Obviously, there's some databases in play. Now, slightly different amount of databases that we're used to compared to the simplicity of maybe Sitecore 6 and things like that. The capacity of the databases that you've got is not really an issue if you start to think about using Azure or using cloud scalable infrastructure. That you find that your core database doesn't need much power, you just turn the DTUs down. You find that the automation piece needs more power, you turn the DTUs up. They're elastic, they can auto-scale. That's one of the things that I think came across really nicely in the first talk, that you should be embracing these technologies. Don't try and stick with running it on a VM that you control. One thing that's quite nice about the whole UI piece of this is they've started to embrace some conventions that maybe were slightly tricky problems to solve back in older versions. So people think of writing UI components in Shear. Good luck. If you were able to do that, then fair play. That was a pretty challenging aspect. Then came Speak. Again, if you managed to get used to writing those components, fair play. That was pretty hard to do. Now we're talking about things like Angular. We're talking about TypeScript. We're talking about Webpack. As technologies, these are pretty much industry standard approaches to UI, aren't they? They add into it Reacts and Views, but within the scope of building UI components, those sorts of things, everyone, well, not everyone, but people very easily know how to use them. They're well documented. They're well understood. And so what does it look like? If you want to go in and build one of these components, so the little entities that we saw in those flowcharts, what are you having to do? So you have to write a bit of HTML, pretty straightforward. And then finally, you talk and interact with the parameters that you've got. Now, we've got 24 lines of code here. So if someone wants to keep count of this, we'll hopefully sum them up at the end and we'll see how much code we had to write to do all this. It's not going to come to a huge amount. It's HTML, it's got CSS in, and it's Angular, and it's done in TypeScript. That's, for a C# developer, that transition really doesn't feel particularly difficult to make. To then allow someone to go in and edit those parameters and to actually work with them, again, we're talking 40 lines of code here, so that's about 60 so far. It's not much. We're not having to do a huge amount of development to build these activities and actions. And then finally, the actual C# bit. So what happens behind the scenes when these activities get invoked? What are we on here? We're probably 30 lines of code. So I reckon we've hit about 100 lines of code in total. It's not a vast amount of development work. The C# aspect of this is really nice because it's got dependency injection available to you. And you can then make use of any of your technology and the builds that you've done of your services, your interfaces that you might have done elsewhere, that you can test in isolation. And you can then, in theory, unit test these things, these activities. Now, we touched a little bit on the concept of listeners, things that chose to fork logic off. And this kind of hangs off rules. So like we said before, the old version of rules was based around running pretty much in the CMS environment. It was pretty coupled to the Sitecore tree. It was quite hard to pull that out. So one thing that you'll see in the new version, if you come to do this sort of thing, then you just have to rewrite your rules ever so slightly. It's pretty easy to do. You've got iCondition is the interface that you implement, and then you build your logic in there. There's some helpers and ways to get access to things like the contacts that you're dealing with, so the contact being the user or the person that's being pulled through the flow. And so then from there, you can get to the facets. You can get to the information you've stored about whether they looked at a snowboard helmet or whether they browsed the site on a sunny day. And we'll come on to that quite neat idea a bit later. So there's integration options here, right? You can come up with any ideas or any kinds of activities that you might think of, and what sort of thing could you do? So we can talk to XConnect. We can go off and get the facet information from the user. We could talk to GraphQL. We could talk to Sitecore's GraphQL. We could talk to someone else's GraphQL. We're running in C#. We can inject these things, so there's no real limitations there. You can talk to Twilio. You can send SMSs and emails that way. You can send through EXM. One thing that we did that was quite interesting, and it was more just a bit of an experiment really, was at the point a user made a booking, we stored what the weather was. So we did an estimate off their IP, which is quite easy to do, so that's kind of built into Sitecore. We went off and saw what the weather was at that point in time, roughly estimating again off their IP, and we stored that back into XDB. Now, probably a cold day in murky London, you're going to see people booking summer holidays. At least you'd think. However, I imagine if you put that data in the hands of data scientists, you'd start to see trends that probably you don't really expect. Now, I imagine the crappy weather here and the sunny trips are probably going to line up somewhat, but it doesn't guarantee that to be the case. But what we were able to do is to drag in these activities and actions so that they could just say, well, why not? Let's go off and get the weather details and store it. And it was all very easy to do because all those tools are available to us. We've got the connection into XDB through XConnect, and there's helpers there to give you that route through. So really, it's just us choosing how we pull this data together and glue it up. Now, it's all well and good having these activities that are just pretty much self-contained functionality, but what about if you need to actually add some parameters to these? What if you want to choose which email to show? Or you want to pick a bit of content to reference and things like that? Well, that's fine. You can do all that through what they call, I think it's editor parameters. They can be configured within Sitecore, and they're things, they're just items that you create in the master database. Now, one of I think the biggest problems that I hit when I was doing some development around this was, why are my variables never getting saved right? Why are they getting lost every single time I interact with my little activities? And that's when message key with a capital M does not equal message key with a lowercase m. Now, my guess, and I couldn't say for certain, but my guess is that what's happening behind the scenes is Sitecore are using something to serialize these parameters to send them into JavaScript, and that's got a naming convention rule in there that's dropping the case of the first letter. This was a pain, and hopefully if any of you do development with this, you will not get caught out by the same problem. And I'll show you in a sec how I actually found it, how I got to the bottom of this, because you need to be able to debug it to see that sort of thing. You set them up in Sitecore as items. It's trivial to do, and hopefully you can see in the key field, that's got a capital M. So that's where I was expecting message key to exist throughout all of this flow. Did in C#, didn't in TypeScript. Okay, so how did we get to the bottom of that? So first up, let's think about how we can debug the actual C# part of the puzzle. So these activities, they run within the scope of the MA engine, like we saw. And we know we've got dependency injection available for us. So actually, we can start to think about, do we need the whole of the engine there running to test them? Probably not, because we could then come up with something like a little console app, and we can just inject fake versions of what we want in at the top and see that we get the right output. Taking that a bit further, you could then, in theory, unit test all of these. There's nothing to stop you mocking with whatever framework choice you use to ensure that all of this works. Okay? So that's them in isolation. That's all well and good, but you probably do want the context of running them with a proper user going through, with actual real data, with real IP addresses, with real behaviors from the site. So how do you do that? So you could run the Windows service, and you just let that run and attach to it. Kind of works, but this feels a bit clunky. If you're building code, deploying it, then having to go and find the running service, attach to it, it can be easier, I promise, it can be easier. So next up, you can just run the MA engine. You'll get all the logs there in the console. So this is starting to get a bit nicer because the debugging that we're putting in, so this like debug activity we've been building, we can actually see the output for. Now this final one, I didn't actually know you could do this until we came onto this project. In Visual Studio, if you want to right-click the solution and choose Add Existing Item, what you can do is you can find that exe on disk, and you can include it in the solution. Then if you were to right-click it, like you can see here, and choose Debug and Start New Instance, it fires up the console app, it attaches the debugger for you, and then will just run your code pretty much on demand. So that's quite a nice little trick that I didn't know about until working with this. So then let's think about the UI. So hopefully we know our C# code is pretty well tried and tested. We've got the ability to test it in isolation, and we can unit test it. That's great. So then what do we do in the UI world? This is how I found out message key is not equal to message key when the casing's wrong. So first up, there's a feature of TypeScript that you can set up when you're doing your builds that you turn on source maps. Now that will generate you a file, something like debugactivity.js.map. And this is quite a commonly used technology. If you deploy this into where the MA engine runs from, into the UI, then you can actually start to debug through the code. So it builds up this mapping of the compiled JavaScript that probably looks like absolute gobbledygook because Webpack's uglified it and minified it and crunched it around in ways that mean it's not very readable. And the maps give you that viewpoint and link back to your files. So build it, deploy it, and copy the maps as well. So you're taking the JavaScript, and then you take the source maps. Then in Chrome, you can choose to add a folder into the workspace. So Chrome DevTools does all sorts of crazy things that only as you start to hit problems and debug through, you see it has these capabilities for, and it's an absolutely brilliant tool when you get used to it. So if you go to the sources part of Chrome, then there's the 5 options beneath. If you choose file system, if you add in the folder where your original source files were, then you can step through and debug through the properties that you've got in your original code, even though you're running this absolutely crazy, mashed up, uglified, minified JavaScript. Now, probably into production, you maybe don't want to deploy the map files, because chances are this stuff should have been caught in dev. But because it's just in the CMS, arguably maybe it isn't too much of a concern. But I'll leave that up to you guys to work out. So how did I find it? Well, I hovered over this .editor params, and I saw the object that was available in there had lowercase m. Only took about 5 or 6 hours and several Slack questions, but hopefully you guys won't make that same mistake and you'll be able to debug it in minutes now. This is really the idea behind this talk. So we're getting closer, right? We've seen how we can actually use these things. We've built our own custom version. We've seen the Angular code for doing that. We've seen how the HTML kind of glues together. We've kind of seen the build process and how to debug it. So finally, how do we deploy this? Now, I'm not sure if people have tried deploying or working with XConnect or any of the sort of periphery parts of Sitecore that's not simply building into the website. It's not as easy as it used to be, but it can be. That's what this slide is going to try and convince you of, as long as you know the steps you need to follow. So first up, XConnect has things like custom facets. And if you've worked with those, they're defined in C#, aren't they? They're the kind of properties that you work with, the data that you want to be able to store against a user. In order to deploy that, you need to generate a schema. So Sitecore give you some tools for doing that. And really, I think, and I assume that that's doing some reflection to map through the types that you've got and then generate a manifest, essentially, or a schema file for you. So first up, you need to generate that. Then you need to deploy that. So one step, generate it. Second step, copy a file somewhere onto the myriad of folders that exist on your dev machine. You've written some custom C# code, so you need to make sure the DLLs follow this around. That's fine, that's pretty standard. So you build something and you copy files around. So far, all we've done is we've built two things and we've copied some things around. Next up, we need to then deploy some configuration that dictates how the marketing automation engine knows where to get the services from, knows where to get dependency injection information from, knows how to understand where the rules live and the namespaces associated with them. So a bit like you would patch your website through patch files, this is a very similar concept, but it's just stored in a slightly different format. It's stored in XML. So that's another file we need to copy around. So we're on 4 or 5 things now. And then finally, you need to copy the config. So this is the way that you can say to the marketing automation engine, what databases do I go off and talk to? This is pretty much your standard ASP.NET style config that everyone will understand. There's a few of those that need doing, but ultimately that's, as a group, I see as kind of the functional things. So every time I was doing development, I had to make a change, copy the schema, well, generate the schema, copy the DLLs, copy the patch config, copy the other configuration. That gets pretty tedious. Just saying it's pretty crap, right? So the first talk we saw, really plays along with this, I think, the idea of automate everything. Now, I'm not saying this is the way you have to do it, but this really saved me some time. I built a little console app that would do all of these steps for me. So if I was to build and run locally, all I would have to do is run one little tool, and that would generate the schema, copy the files, and so on and so on and so on. So then I was starting to use this up on a server. So I was deploying it through Octopus. First step of Octopus, deploy the website. Second step of Octopus, generate schema, deploy the schema, generate the... No, I didn't. In the end, all I had to do was just run the same executable, but with a parameter that told it maybe which folder to go to. And then finally, all of the stuff just glued together every single deploy. I didn't need to do anything hugely clever. If this is of interest, it is up on GitHub, I think, so there's nothing particularly clever about it. It does those 5 steps in order. Use it, abuse it, yeah, it's up to you. I found it incredibly useful, so hopefully you guys will as well. And so where to find out more? What steps to take if this is of interest and you fancy kind of doing this and working with it? Well, the docs site, that's got to be a real good start point. Now, on there's a video on I think, the homepage of Marketing Automation that talks about some of the things we've seen, but really in more detail. So it digs into exactly what's happening under the hood, the specifics of the connection into XConnect, the interfaces that are available to you, probably a bit more around the architecture that we've not really seen, but at least gets you going. And then for those of you that aren't developers, those of you that are marketers, there's loads of material that Sitecore have got around this. And as a sort of functional concept, marketing automation there's loads to it. So yeah, you'll be able to find it if the appetite is there. So just to kind of wrap up, really, trying to bring this together, we've seen what is marketing automation. It's getting that email behind the scenes. It's getting those messages to prompt you about something that maybe you did and the behaviors that follow on from it. We've seen how Sitecore approach this, so what the MA engine is and how that runs, how you debug it, how you can just work with it, how you can build custom aspects to it. And then finally, how do you deploy it? What are the sorts of things that you just need to consider so that when you come to get this up into the cloud, what steps do you follow for it to run? So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them now. I hope that was useful, and I'll leave it there. And thanks to the sponsors.
Great, thank you.
Hey.
The service running on CM?
So the service can run pretty much where you want it to. The idea being that you can scale not to just having a single one of them. So the frailty of the older version of engagement plans was fixed to running in the IS process, whereas now it's you create multiple. And there are things it has to talk to. You have to have the connection strings to certain databases, but the idea being it can scale. Yeah, that's right, which is the executable we saw, yeah. Huh? Yeah.
With this being a separate application, you know the class you built with custom activities, so the C# class?
Yeah.
Send an email on, send a text, type of thing. Do you recommend having that in a separate solution, say, like an automation of the CMS solution?
So for anyone that didn't hear it, was where do you keep the code for your custom activities, wasn't it? That's something along those lines. I mean, it depends on your development choice, really. Personally, I probably wouldn't keep it in my same build as stuff for your CM. But then saying that, if you're starting to build rules that you want to be common, you might find there is a bit of crossover. It's how you work with Visual Studio. I kept them in the same place for this, but that maybe isn't the best way. Yeah, this is. Yeah, so I think the DevOps pipeline you'd build around it is quite different because you're not pushing to a web application, you're pushing a Windows service and the schemas and all the bits we saw.
Is the MA engine making, is it making the XConnect calls? Like when you want a context facet, is the contact ID in the data and you can just make a call to the XConnect, get back your custom facet, work with it, then proceed on through the automation?
Exactly that, yeah. So in at the top is the ability to get the current contact that's relevant to that flow based on the rule, probably at the start point. So the rule might be they've done something, they've got something in their basket, their session's expired. Or you choose to push them in the plan. From any of your actions, you can then go off and say, yes, get me the contact, get me the facets from it, work with them, manipulate them, update them, perform actions based on them.
If you rolled back like 15 slides and it had the code, was there a spot in there where the Angular matched up with the code C# class?
So that, actually, I've jumped to probably the right place here. It's done through the a combination of the config in the patch, so the marketing automation activity types XML,
okay.
And then I believe it's some content within Sitecore that glues the two together.
So that this JavaScript action runs that code when it executes?
Yeah,
Gotcha.
there's a link between them that essentially is mapping from the UI elements through to the core data that's running. So, yeah.
Does it make logical sense? Is it hard to follow? Or?
It's relatively simple because what you're doing is you are creating. Let me just see if I can find the. It was about 15 slides back. You're right. Were you counting them? Oh no, I'm not going to be able to find it now. Sorry about this. Tell you what, I can show you afterwards if worse comes to worse. Now here we go. So you create within Sitecore that debug activity, and that's the kind of the link between your C# implementation, as it needs to be through a GUID, of the item and the UI.
Oh, I remember where you had the ID.
Yeah.
Where it wired it up with that activity.
That's it, exactly. So.
You mentioned when you're working with your campaigns.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes, you mentioned working with your campaigns, and when you save that essentially becomes a blob of JSON.
Yeah.
In the master database, and that gets, for want of a better term, published to the MA engine.
Yeah.
Is that MA engine central to the content delivery servers and the content management server, but actually doesn't do anything yet until you actually publish the items to your content delivery servers, and then or is there a step to kind of move that from a CM MA engine to a CD MA engine?
Well, the sort of concept of publishing is slightly different. You're not pushing stuff to the web database. You're pushing things in a way that's able to be accessed from the MA engine. So you're not saying go up to CDs at all. I don't think CDs play a part of that. It's pushing it out to your the engines that are running, the services that are running in the separate places. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Master database for the UI, and then you deploy to the MA engine, which does all of the actual hard work. But the master database is controlling the user experience, what you can drag and drop where, and so on.
So it's not to your point, you're not publishing anything. It's just, there's an engine, I work on stuff, I save it, and it updates the engine.
It does have the concept of deploy or activate, which is kind of its terminology for it publishing to that engine. So similar concept, but different end goal.
I've got a question. Where is this TypeScript code stored? Is it on a CM machine, or is it on where our marketing automation plan is?
So the actual engine itself runs as a Windows service, so that doesn't need access to Angular and doesn't need any of the TypeScript. The TypeScript's for the UI, which runs within the CMS, so within the thing we saw right at the start. So you would deploy your new files into the authoring environment. You don't need them anywhere else.
Do you have some nice strategy how to create, how to work with the update of the activities? I mean, you will create a new activity action, and then you will put it to the plan, and then, all right, you will create many plans, and then you will update that activity.
Yep.
So what then?
Yep, all done. And then you run off and hide. What then? So examples being you change the functionality of an activity, that sort of thing, do you mean? That you might want to add more features to the ones you've got?
Example can be like you will break the activity from, I mean,
Yeah.
so what will happen with the plans? Because the older plan will not work probably because the activity, maybe the parameter is missing already, you know, so is there any way how to find at least where the activity is used?
You could actually, yeah. So if we go back to the slide where I kind of debucketed the stuff.
You mean this JSON?
That's it, yeah. So if we were to, it's not ideal, but you could create versioned activities. So you could have send email v1, send email v2. It's not great, but based on the current landscape of what you have, that feels like a safer way to potentially avoid breaking changes like that. I have to say, for the demo I put together, I didn't hit that problem because I didn't have to make changes beyond the scope of the demo. So if anyone else has good ideas on that, then yeah, here's the guy to speak to. Okay, well, thank you.